The legend everyone knows, and the one they forgot. When people hear the name Dracula, they imagine blood, terror, and impaled bodies lining the roads of Wallachia. Vlad the Impaler became a nightmare whispered across Europe, and even the Ottoman Empire remembered him with fear. But here is the truth history rarely tells you. The Ottomans feared another man even more. Not a monster, not a myth, but a warrior king whose name made generals hesitate and sultans rethink their campaigns. His name was Stephen the Great of Moldavia. God save us! Give us the strength to fight and survive this day. Stephen was not cruel for spectacle like Vlad. He did not rule by terror alone. They expect us to retreat here. We will not. We strike hard at this position by dawn. While Dracula shocked the Ottomans with brutality, Stephen defeated them again and again, on open battlefields, where fear mattered less than results.
By the mid-15th century, the Ottoman Empire was unstoppable. Cities fell.
Kingdoms bowed. Even powerful European rulers surrendered or paid tribute.
But Moldavia did not. And the reason was one man.
The nightmare of the Ottoman generals truly began long before the first sword was raised, because Stephen the Great understood something most rulers of his time did not. Wars were not won by numbers alone, but by patience, preparation, and the ability to turn nature itself into a weapon. As the massive Ottoman army advanced toward Moldavia in 1475, confident in its size and reputation, Stephen avoided direct confrontation, refusing to give the enemy the decisive battle they desired. Instead, he ordered villages emptied, crops burned, wells poisoned, and roads destroyed, forcing the Ottomans to march deeper into hostile land with dwindling supplies and rising frustration, every step exhausting their men and animals. Ottoman commanders, trained to crush resistance through overwhelming force, found themselves chasing shadows, small Moldavian units appearing briefly, striking supply lines, then vanishing into forests and marshes. The deeper they advanced, the more vulnerable they became, unaware that Stephen was carefully guiding them toward a place of his choosing. That place was Vaslui, a narrow valley surrounded by forests and swamps, where winter fog clung to the ground like a living thing. On the morning of the battle, the Ottomans faced not a clear enemy line, but confusion. Thick mist reduced visibility to almost nothing, muffling commands and distorting distances. Stephen positioned his forces with ruthless intelligence, placing infantry and archers where the terrain limited Ottoman movement, while cavalry waited hidden, ready to strike when panic spread. When the battle began, Moldavian horns echoed from multiple directions, amplified by the fog and terrain, creating the illusion of a massive army encircling the Ottomans. Ottoman soldiers, unable to see the true size or position of the enemy, began to hesitate, their formations breaking as commanders shouted contradictory orders that vanished into the mist. At Stephen's signal, arrows rained down relentlessly, striking men who could neither advance nor retreat, while the muddy ground swallowed horses and artillery alike. The Ottomans tried to regroup, but every attempt only pushed them deeper into chaos, as Moldavian forces struck suddenly, withdrew, and struck again, turning discipline into desperation. What should have been a straightforward victory became a slow collapse, as fear replaced confidence and survival replaced strategy. Stephen personally oversaw the timing of every phase, waiting until the enemy was fully disoriented before unleashing his cavalry, which slammed into the Ottoman flanks with devastating force, transforming retreat into massacre. By the end of the day, the valley of Vaslui was covered with the dead, wounded, and captured, marking one of the most catastrophic defeats the Ottoman Empire had suffered in Europe. News of the disaster spread rapidly, shocking not only Istanbul but the entire continent, because it shattered the myth of Ottoman invincibility at the height of its power. For Ottoman generals, Stephen the Great was no longer merely a defiant ruler of a small frontier state. He was a commander who understood their methods, anticipated their moves, and exploited their weaknesses with terrifying precision. Unlike Vlad the Impaler, whose cruelty inspired fear but also rebellion and instability, Stephen inspired loyalty, discipline, and unwavering resistance among his people, allowing him to rebuild forces quickly and remain a constant threat. Even after victories, Ottoman commanders knew that facing Stephen meant enduring a campaign of attrition, deception, and relentless pressure, where every forest could hide an ambush and every valley could become a grave. The Battle of Vaslui was not an isolated triumph, but a message written in blood. Moldavia would not fall easily, and Stephen would not fight on the enemy's terms. For the Ottoman Empire, this was the most frightening reality of all. Not a ruler who terrified through brutality, but one who defeated them through mastery of war itself, again and again, forcing even the most experienced generals to admit that Stephen the Great was an enemy unlike any other they had faced. The true reason Stephen the Great terrified the Ottoman Empire more than Dracula becomes clear when the echoes of battle fade and history looks not at spectacle, but at endurance, because empires do not fear momentary cruelty as much as they fear long-term resistance that refuses to break. Vlad the Impaler's reigns were brief, chaotic, and marked by extreme brutality that shocked enemies and subjects alike, creating a reputation that spread faster than his actual power. But fear alone could not build stable alliances, sustain armies, or hold borders against a superpower for decades. Stephen, by contrast, represented a far more dangerous reality for the Ottomans, a ruler who transformed a small, seemingly insignificant principality into a permanent obstacle, forcing the empire to repeatedly divert troops, resources, and attention to a region that should have been easily conquered. His rule lasted nearly half a century, long enough for multiple Ottoman commanders to rise and fall, long enough for sultans to change, and long enough for defeat to become a recurring memory rather than a rare embarrassment. Each time the Ottomans marched into Moldavia, they faced not a desperate last stand, but a carefully prepared defense rooted in loyalty, faith, and an intimate understanding of the land. And this consistency slowly eroded the empire's confidence in its own inevitability. Stephen did not rely on terror to control his people. Instead, he cultivated devotion by presenting himself as both warrior and protector, fighting alongside his men, praying with them, and rebuilding churches and fortresses as symbols of unity and purpose, ensuring that Moldavian resistance did not collapse after a single defeat. For the Ottomans, this meant that even when Stephen lost a battle, he did not lose the war, because his authority remained unchallenged and his people remained willing to fight again, a phenomenon that frightened imperial strategists far more than gruesome punishments ever could. While Dracula's cruelty made him infamous, it also isolated him politically and weakened his long-term position, allowing the Ottomans to view him as a temporary problem, a violent but unstable ruler who could eventually be removed or replaced. Stephen, however, could not be dismissed so easily, because his victories were not accidents and his defeats were never final, forcing Ottoman leaders to confront the uncomfortable truth that their empire was not invincible when faced with intelligent, disciplined opposition. Even Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople and one of the most formidable rulers of his age, recognized that Stephen represented a unique threat, not because he inspired terror, but because he inspired resistance, proving to other Christian states that the Ottomans could be challenged and beaten under the right conditions. This was perhaps the greatest danger Stephen posed. He shattered the psychological dominance upon which imperial expansion depended, replacing fear with the possibility of defiance, a possibility that could spread far beyond Moldavia's borders. Over time, Stephen's persistence forced the Ottomans into a strategic compromise, accepting tribute rather than total conquest, an outcome that signaled limits to imperial power and acknowledged that Moldavia under Stephen was simply too costly to subdue completely. When compared to Dracula's legacy, the contrast becomes unavoidable. One became a symbol of horror, remembered for the bodies he left behind, while the other became a symbol of resilience, remembered for the empire he held at bay. For the Ottomans, Dracula was a nightmare that eventually ended, but Stephen the Great was a recurring problem that refused to disappear, generation after generation, campaign after campaign. In the cold calculations of empire, this made Stephen far more frightening, because he represented not chaos, but control, not madness, but mastery, and not momentary fear, but a sustained challenge to Ottoman dominance itself. In the end, history reveals that the greatest threat to an empire is not a ruler who terrifies through cruelty, but one who teaches others that the empire can be resisted. And that is why Stephen the Great, more than Dracula, earned a place among the most feared enemies the Ottoman Empire ever faced.